Hello and welcome back to Dave's Movie Diary. Today I'm talking about a film called Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters from 1985, directed by Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader, I think, is a very interesting filmmaker who's been around since the 70s, and not just as a director but as a screenwriter. And he's actually shaped some of the key films of American cinema, principally working with people like Martin Scorsese. I first saw this film some time ago. I can't actually remember when, because the film didn't really connect with me. I think I only watched it to cover off on a movie that gets really high ratings everywhere. It's talked about as a significant piece of work. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like I should watch particular movies like this. Well, I used to, more than now. I felt like, if I was taking movies seriously, I should watch movies like this. And a lot of times that was a good idea. This time, with this one initially, it wasn't a great idea. And so it disappeared from my memory after that. Occasionally I would hear talk about this film. It'd pop up in lists of the best films of the last 100 years or what have you. And I just dismissed it and thought, that's one the critics got wrong in terms of what I think about it. I didn't see the big deal about it. Yeah, anyway, it just popped up the other day on Mubi, M-U-B-I, which is a bit like the Criterion channel. Here in Australia, it's the closest thing you can legally access that has, I guess, movies from around the world, left of center movies, something a bit different from way back to now. A really good melting pot, I guess, of international cinema. And I thought, well, it's been a long time. Maybe it's worth checking out again. I'm a lot older. And Schrader himself has always interested me because he's willing to work across quite controversial or uncomfortable or even philosophically loaded material without softening it and being unapologetic about it. So I thought, yep, to hell with it. I'll sit down and give it another look. It's a true story. It's a look at the life of Japanese writer Yukio Mishima, from childhood through to his death in 1970. And Mishima was apparently like Japan's most revered writer before his demise in 1970. He was very well known in Japan and probably wider as well. He seemed to be a major figure, not just in the literature world, but just a well-known cultural figure. Schrader separates the narrative into three alternating forms. He goes back and looks at Mishima's actual real life and uses a lot of black and white dramatizations of that. And he then does some quite interesting color sequences based on his novels and also some theatrical stage-like reconstructions of symbolic or ideological moments from his literature. And so I guess the key points there are that Mishima was born quite physically fragile and spent a large part of his childhood under the strict care of his grandmother. She isolated him in a really controlled domestic environment, took him to the theatre a lot, and that shaped his early imagination and attachment to books. Later on, she returns him to his mother when he's a teenager, and the World War II is underway. And he grows up during this period of increasing national tension in Japan, and writing becomes his central focus. And then he develops into a very successful writer in post-war Japan. And he's very prolific, and his public profile grows steadily, and he becomes nationally recognized. And his work starts to reflect, I guess, increasing concerns around discipline and identity, beauty, control, all sorts of things. But where it gets really interesting I mean, his life is really interesting, but where it gets even more interesting for me in this film is the intercut novel sequences. So Schrader repeatedly puts in these stylized adaptations of Mishima's fiction. A couple in particular I thought were quite interesting. There's a feudal era story involving a stuttering soldier who's unable to express anything at all, really, but he's unable to find intimacy with a girl, and he's paired with a friend who's got a disorder with his foot, and but the friend's quite a lecherous rogue, and shows him how to use his stutter to his advantage. It doesn't quite go well, but it's an intriguing subject to explore. And then there's a more modern story involving a young man whose mother operates a cafe, and the mother is into significant debt with a woman in her 40s. It's like 11 million yen or something. This is in the late 50s. And the young man agrees to enter into a no-holds-barred relationship with the older woman, and in return, she will write off the debt to the young man's mother. And increasingly over time, there's a lot of bondage and wounding that occurs to the young man. So these sequences are really quite visually artificial and highly stylized. There's a lot of saturated colors, pinks, reds, pastel colors. The sets that these aspects of the film occur on are obviously constructed like on a stage. There's no hiding it. It's accentuating this aspect. It's not trying to make it look realistic. I guess so that us as viewers can definitely tell what's happened in Mishima's life, and what is being reflected in Mishima's literature. I've got to say the sets look fantastic, and they kind of reminded me of the color schemes that Francis Ford Coppola used on that the 1982 film that he made with Frederick Forrest. And for the life of me, I can't remember what it's called. Oh, One from the Heart. That's right, One from the Heart, which wasn't a very successful film, but it had this similarly constructed look where Coppola wasn't trying to pretend that it was anything but a set. It looked incredible. That's a film I haven't seen for a long time. And I feel like Schrader is kind of aiming for the same artificiality, if that makes any sense. Normally directors are going in the opposite direction, but Schrader makes it work really well, I feel, in this film, making it clear what's stylized and what is biographical. And then later in the film too, the narrative returns chiefly to Mishima's life, especially in the 60s. By then, he's a well-known, like a national treasure. He has become used to fame. He's quite cynical now. He's in his probably late 40s, I suppose. And he's turning his mind more towards what he sees wrong with Japan, and I guess things like ideological ideas about what's Japanese identity now? What's happened to the country? Um, Also gets very focused on physical discipline, a lot of weightlifting. Actually, if you go onto YouTube, you'll see some examples of this. What his regimen became like. I didn't watch these videos, but I just flicked through them. There's quite a lot on there about Mishima. Um, some interviews with him apparently at his house, and you can see that they've um, either used the same house exactly. You can even see the outdoor furniture's the same in the interview that I briefly scanned. So Schrader's definitely done his homework on this subject, and it's obviously something that's dear to his heart. Whether he is just fascinated with Mishima, or whether it was the literature that Mishima produced, or whether it's both, I'm not sure. But anyway, getting back to the narrative, by this stage in the 60s, yeah, like I said, Mishima's really focusing on this physical discipline, ideology, and building up like a private militia with these young male followers. And they train in this really ritualized, disciplined environment that's influenced by Mishima's aesthetic and ideological beliefs. They wear uniforms. They seem to follow military structure. And eventually, Mishima comes to the conclusion that he has to do something significant to try and force through change in Japan. And he takes 4 of his young followers to a military facility. They go in there. Mishima is recognized and gains entrance quite easily. Like I said, he's a major celebrity at the time. And the head of the facility is more than happy to meet with him and his young followers. And Mishima shows him an ancient sword that he's brought along. That is very fascinating for the boss of the facility. And then they jump him. They tie him up, and they barricade themselves in there. They make a deal with the other soldiers to go out onto the balcony, and Mishima will give a speech to the assembled cadets or soldiers down below. And this is all on YouTube too. You can see fragments of his speech. He addresses the assembly there with a very sort of nationalistic speech, calling for I think the end goal is calling for restoration of imperial authority in Japan. So the emperor, who was ousted after World War II, and the speech is rejected and it's mocked, and they're throwing things at Mishima. And whether he planned that or not, the final act he had planned. He returns inside and commits ritual suicide, known as seppuku, which is something that's rooted in Japanese feudal history. And yeah, that was the end. It's just a stunning. You can't make this stuff up. It's an incredible story, and it's well worthy of a. Is it a documentary? It's part documentary, I suppose, but there's a lot of Schrader's individual stamp on this film. Really interesting topic. Like I said, Schrader he's still making films, and he's done a lot of screenwriting as well as directing. He has been, I think, quite controversial and outspoken since the 70s, since the mid 70s. Generally, he's preoccupied with ideas around guilt, male guilt, masculinity, discipline, people being repressed, systems breaking down into extreme violence. a lot of times in his films, men are attempting to impose structure onto situations where there's chaos. He's really interested in internal belief systems, and whether those systems can overpower reality. Often they can't, obviously. But if you look at, like, here's some films that he directed. He directed films including American Gigolo, which is a very underrated film in my view. Love that film. Cat People with Nastassja Kinski. That's a really interesting update of the 1940s film. Autofocus, which is about the Bob Crane, who was the actor in Hogan's Heroes. That's a revealing biopic. More recently, a couple of really good films. One being The Card Counter with Oscar Isaac, and also Master Gardener, which is it's quite a different film too, with Joel Edgerton. Can highly recommend both of those films. I think with Schrader's films, there's always something different. He has a different slant on reality, which I find intriguing. Like, if you listen to those titles, none of them are mass appeal films. He also made a film called Hardcore at the end of the 70s with George C. Scott, which is relatively well known, about a dad whose daughter becomes caught up in the porn industry, and he goes there to rescue her from the porn industry in LA. Worth checking out as well. You think those are interesting? Look at the screenplays he also wrote. Taxi Driver, a little film called Taxi Driver. You might have heard of that one. Raging Bull, again, significant works, masterworks. Worked heavily on The Last Temptation of Christ and Bringing Out the Dead. So there's four well-known Scorsese films, especially the first two. Also wrote the screenplay for Rolling Thunder, which is a great revenge flick with Tommy Lee Jones and William Devane. He wrote the script for The Yakuza, which is a Robert Mitchum mid-70s effort, and also The Mosquito Coast. That was a great novel. I highly recommend that novel to anyone, and it's a Harrison Ford film. So an interesting guy who is more than happy to court controversy for his art. So watching the film, you can probably tell that the first time I saw it, it wasn't what I was expecting at all. It was too slow. I was too young. It must have been in my early or mid-20s, I think, before I was really aware enough, or maybe mature enough to understand what this film was about. So on the rewatch, fully locked in, concentrating, with more context and a lot more patience and just life experience, this became a far more interesting watch. And I really appreciated the unconventional narrative. It's not an easy film always to follow in a traditional sense. The shifts between the black and white realism of Mishima's past, the color, the really colorized, garish at times, fictional aspects, and the stage construction element create a constant sense of instability. But to me, it felt intentionally structured to kind of go against the grain and fight against just a passive retelling of Mishima's story, which really worked for me. And what stood out this time was how deliberately Schrader builds Mishima's life. And for me, it was inseparable from his ideology. That was really who he became towards the end of his life. And he's definitely not a simple biographical subject. There's so much going on there, and it's inextricably linked with Japan's pre-World War II sort of eminence. The effect of two nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then obviously the rebuilding of Japan and trying to, I guess, work out what Japanese identity became. And I think finally this merging of art and ideology becomes the dominant force of the film. So for me, extra context, I've always been really fascinated by Japanese culture, mainly through literature and film. I haven't been there. I was meant to go there, but it fell through a couple of times. I'll definitely get there. What initially got me interested was reading Shogun, the classic 70s novel by James Clavell. I was reading that when I had a broken ankle, and I couldn't do anything else but sit there and read Shogun, and I think I finished it in about 3 days, which for me was pretty good. It's a pretty thick, it's like 800 pages or something, but it was fascinating. I couldn't get through it quickly enough. I read the whole series. There's like I think there's 4 or 5 books in the series. It ends up with a book called Whirlwind, which is about the revolution in Iran. Interestingly, that's tied in. I read those a long time ago, but I was fascinated by the structures and the rituals and the layering of Japanese society that's so different from the West. And just the ceremonies, the tea ceremonies, the samurai aspects, honor, and lots of just totally different to what I'd experienced, and fascinating, reinforced by reading other things like Memoirs of a Geisha, which further heightened that just difference and really interesting society. Like I said, I think a big part of Mishima's experience and focus was trying to get past or reconcile what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I can't speak to, and it just must have been a devastating experience, and still has lasting effects probably until today and into the future. Even though the Cold War's over, there's still the specter of nuclear weapons, obviously. And I think Mishima's ideological concerns around Japanese identity and the national structure, and getting back to pre-World War, I guess, power structures with the emperor, become his focus leading up to the irrevocable events at the end of the film. So there's a lot to take on here. So it's definitely not a date film. I can't imagine this as a date film. It's probably not even a shared viewing experience film unless you're watching it with someone who's really interested in this material as well, because it requires a lot of attention and patience, and you've just got to be interested in the subject matter, or at least in Japan's identity through this period. And equally, it's just not a hangover film. It is far too dense and structured and philosophically loaded. It's, again, like I just said, a solitary, focused viewing experience rather than something you can have on in the background or just be checking in on now and then. It would break your brain if you tried to watch this with a hangover. I do not recommend. And it's just it's worth checking out when you're fully aware and switched on. So so glad I rewatched it. It reframed the film in my mind now. I've got a really good opinion of this one. And I think what pushed me away in the first place actually draws me in now. And I can see that Schrader has constructed this system for a purpose rather than just telling a conventional biography, which still would have been captivating because of Mishima and what he achieved in the world of literature and beyond. And it's still really challenging, but the challenge now feels intentional in watching this film rather than pushing me away. So, like I said earlier, I think ultimately it felt to me a film about what happens when someone's life, public life, becomes indistinguishable from the ideology that they've built around themselves, and that sums up Mishima for me. So, yeah, if you're interested in Japan, recent Japanese history, or if you're into Mishima, or if you're really into Paul Schrader, or this kind of filmmaking that's challenging, can highly recommend. Otherwise, approach it with caution and just be warned that you're not going to get a structured linear experience, or even it's more like a documentary, but it's quite stylized, if that makes sense. So, as always, thanks for listening, and that is Mishima from 1985. So, catch you next time.